The Spanish painter Francisco Goya is often said to be both the last of the old masters and the first of the modern ones, which is quite the achievement. It's hard enough to be a master of one period, let alone two, but Goya seems to pull it off. Much of his success is owed to his prodigious talents as a painter, but another equally important factor, as is so often the case, was the rapidly changing times he lived in. Goya was born in the late 18th century, a period of great change for his native Spain. During this time, the ideas of the Enlightenment were spreading across Europe and calling into question many of the traditional beliefs society was organised around. Writers such as Voltaire, Roseau and Locke had all proposed new ideas which questioned the traditional power structures of church and state and called for more rational and humanistic approaches to organising society. These ideas and the reforms they triggered would have massive cultural impact and play an important role in the eventual development of modern art. As an artist who lived through this period, Goya offers us a fascinating look at the influence these ideas had on artists. Goya's career is particularly interesting in this regard as it shows us not only the successes of Enlightenment thinking, but also the ramifications of its failures. While Goya was at first a believer, over the course of his career he would lose faith in the dream of the Enlightenment, as many of their promised reforms failed to materialise, and those that did had unintended consequences. Today, we're going to take a look at Goya and his works, as well as the role those Enlightenment ideas played in shaping him into the first modern master, and perhaps the great-grandfather of modern art. Francisco Goya was born in the rural Spanish village of Fuenditodos in 1746. The son of a gilder who made his living providing decorative arts for the church, Goya would receive a modest education and began to study painting at 14 under the local painter José Luzán y Martínez, and later continued his studies in Madrid under the German artist Anton Raphael Mengs. The young Goya is often said to have clashed with his tutors and felt that he was passed over unfairly for honours and awards. He twice failed to win a prestigious residency in Rome, and rather than try a third time, instead decided to simply travel there himself. A visit to Rome was foundational for many artists, and no doubt it was for Goya as well, though we have no records of his time there. Rome was a treasure trove of art going back centuries, and it was common for artists to visit the city and other ancient sites to learn from these works, a practice referred to by the aristocratic classes as the Grand Tour. While we don't know exactly what Goya got up to in Rome, it must have done him some good, as upon his return to Spain he quickly garnered commissions that would help him climb from his lowly status as a provincial craftsman to a lofty posting in the Spanish royal court. This early success came in the form of a series of designs which Goya was commissioned to produce for decorative tapestries. These tapestries were created for the palaces of the Spanish nobility, and as such, many of these works are light-hearted and feature bright and decorative compositions. They depict scenes of leisure activities popular with the aristocratic classes, such as hunting, as well as scenes of workers and peasants that show the people as content and joyous. The bright colours and flowing designs of these works, as well as their decorative nature, puts them loosely under the Rococo style, a kind of artwork that was favoured by many in the ruling classes of the day because of its opulent style that fit well with the finery of their palaces. While Goya began to make a name for himself with these designs, he wasn't entirely happy with the job. One problem was that he felt constrained by the process. His initial designs often had to be simplified, as they needed to be workable at different stages of the production process. Another problem was the subjects themselves, which showed the peasantry as the nobles liked to imagine them: rosy-cheeked, content, and above all, productive. As an artist who considered himself a man of the people, Goya knew this to be far from the truth. The Spanish peasantry of the day was, for the most part, poor, uneducated, and lived in a culture steeped in superstitions. Goya knew this firsthand from his childhood, and it must have made the saccharine tapestries the nobility demanded a somewhat bitter pill to swallow. On top of this, Goya was also aware that it didn't really have to be this way. As a man of some learning, he had heard the talk of reforms across Europe. The thinkers and philosophers of the Enlightenment had outlined new ideas of how society could be run in a more rational fashion, how education for all was needed, and how a state could be organised for the benefit of everyone instead of a few inbred nobles at the top. These ideas were appealing to many, Goya included, and while we may assume the nobility would oppose such threats to their dominance, in an unusual turn of events, the advocates of the Enlightenment found a powerful ally in Charles III, the then ruling king of Spain. Charles III was a big proponent of the Enlightenment. He was a believer in enlightened absolutism, which championed many of the new ideas, while still maintaining the need for an absolute monarchy. I mean, no need to go crazy here. He began many economic and social reforms and even advocated greater education. He also chose members of his court from educated people who were suitable to their jobs, but not necessarily members of the aristocratic classes, something that was almost unthinkable at the time. These newly appointed members of the court were sometimes referred to as the ilustrados, or educated ones. Goya, who was appointed court painter to Charles III, counted many among this new meritocratic class as his friends, and frequently painted them in flattering ways. We can see this in works such as his portrait of Don Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos, a statesman who favoured education for all as well as the abolition of torture, which were some pretty progressive ideas at the time. Goya's portrait depicts Jovellanos sitting at a desk covered in paperwork, showing him to be a man of learning. Also present is a statue of the goddess of wisdom Minerva, which characterises Jovellanos as wise and educated, exactly the kind of person Goya admired. Goya filled many of his court portraits with such flattery of those who championed his ideals, but there is also a commonly held belief that he did the opposite too, painting satirical portraits of his ideological enemies. The reality of this, however, is much less clear than the praise of his friends is. Rarely, if ever, was any criticism of his enemies made explicit, as doing so would not have been in the best interests of either his health or his finances, despite the leniency of many at court. One well-known example of this supposed satirical portraiture would come many years and one monarch later, in the form of the work Charles IV of Spain and his Family, which is often said to showcase Goya's lampooning of those in power. Unlike the reforming Charles III, who had initially brought Goya to court, Charles IV was not regarded as a very good king. He was quite a hands-off monarch, preferring hunting and drinking to ruling, and his court was filled with scandal and mismanagement, which you may think would make him ripe for satire, and which this portrait is often said to be. In this image, we see the royals grouped together in a somewhat naturalistic composition, as if they had all dropped by Goya's studio en masse for a chat and a cup of tea, rather than this being a staged composition. This informality was intended to humanise the royals, a goal which is helped along by many of the passages of beautiful loose painting which Goya would become known for. What is particularly odd about this work, however, is the placement of the figures. Charles IV himself, rather than being central as we may think a king should be, is off to the side. His wife, Maria Luisa, instead takes the central role, perhaps alluding to the idea that she was the real power behind the throne, rather than her feckless husband, who would probably rather be hunting. Also present are the king's children. The two here on the left, in complementary blue and orange, are Carlos and Ferdinand, who are rumoured to be the result of an affair between Maria Luisa and her lover, the Prime Minister Manuel Godoy. Besides all of this, the idea that the painting is a veiled critique of the immorality of the reign of Charles IV is hinted at in a few ways. Firstly, the character of the royal expressions, which is perhaps not showing their best side. Usually, royal portraits would put the best spin possible on the monarch's appearance, though Goya seemingly hasn't bothered with much of that here. The presence of a painting within a painting, which Goya has placed in the background, apparently depicting the biblical tale of Lot and his daughters, also carries implications of immorality and incest, which mirror accusations made against these royals themselves. Goya himself hides in the shadows beside this Hamlet-style inclusion, perhaps having a good laugh at the expense of these foolish nobles. Or perhaps not. For all of the implied criticisms, this could, for once, just as easily be a case of reading too much into things. The critic Robert Hughes puts it excellently when he points out that these royals, despite any moral shortcomings, were not stupid, and Goya would not have held his position as court painter for very long if he had been openly or even covertly mocking in tone. To quote Hughes on the subject, "You didn't manage to keep your job as an official court portraitist if you were satirising the people you were painting. This is not a send-up. If anything, it is an act of flattery. For instance, on the left, in the blue shirt, is one of the most odious little toads in the entire history of Spanish politics, the future King Ferdinand VII, whom Goya actually manages to make look quite regal. God knows how he did it, but he has." Hughes, as usual, hits the nail on the head here. While Charles IV would have been a prime target for some satire, it was pretty unlikely that this was actually the case. Despite the increasingly liberal ideas of the day, it was not exactly a free and open society where artists like Goya could do as they please, and still expect to keep their cushy court painter jobs. Instead, the tales of Goya as a rebellious court painter speaking truth to power may be somewhat embellished. While Goya by this point was still sympathetic to Enlightenment ideals, the court of Charles IV was perhaps less enthusiastic about them than their predecessors had been, and they made little progress on those promised reforms. This unfulfilled promise would sow seeds of doubt in Goya, which we'll see grow into disillusionment later on. While reform had stalled in Spain, France was having its own crack at it, which was quite a lot more enthusiastic. The revolution which swept France in 1789 was a result of many factors, including those Enlightenment ideals. This pivotal event had many outcomes that would shape the course of history, but the immediate result for Spain came in the form of a certain Corsican general who, having seized power, would send his armies marching south in 1808 with the goal of doing to the Spanish monarchy what the revolution had done to the French. Napoleon's armies tore across Spain and seized Madrid with little resistance. The Spanish forces, unable to match the more modern French military, engaged in a vicious and bloody guerrilla war against the occupiers, which resulted in many uprisings and atrocities. Goya, who had remained in Madrid under occupation, was present for one of these rebellions, which he famously put to canvas some years later in an important pair of works known as the 2nd and 3rd of May. The 2nd of May shows a scene of carnage as the Spanish rebels attack a cavalry unit of Napoleonic Mamelukes in the streets of Madrid. The attackers pose like matadors as they throw the soldiers from their horses and kill them where they fall. It is a scene of violence and carnage as horses clash and bodies fall in a vision of chaos which is tinged with nationalism and pride. Its wild brushwork and clashing forms evoke the chaos of battle. Its companion piece, the 3rd of May, however, intentionally contrasts this in every way. The 3rd of May shows the reprisal of the Napoleonic army the next day, when the rebels were rounded up and put to death for their insurrection. While this scene is based on real events, and Goya was present in the city at the time, he most likely did not witness it himself. This is instead a dramatic reimagining, which tells us much of Goya's stance on the war, and shows how his work was developing from that of a simple court painter into something that was much more modern. Unlike traditional depictions of war and sacrifice, this painting does not convey any heroics or valiant last stands. Instead, the victims show fear on their faces. Their eyes wide in terror stand out vividly against the dark tones of the scene. Their assailants, the firing line of French soldiers, are in contrast to their victims faceless. Hunched over and blocked together, they act as one single insect-like mass. Unlike the condemned, they show no trace of humanity. Instead, they seem almost mechanical in nature. The focal point of the work is the central figure, which immediately draws our attention owing to its bright tonality in contrast to the rest of this dark painting. Comparisons between his pose and traditional depictions of Christ with his arms outstretched are obvious, backed up by the inclusion of a stigmata mark at his hand, as well as his unusual proportions. If we look closely, we will see that he is kneeling, meaning that if he were to stand up, he would be almost twice the height of the soldiers. This strange proportion is most likely another reference to the language of religious art, where size was often directly proportional to holiness. This image puts a lot of emphasis on the individual, and it is reinforced by the way Goya handles his paint and arranges his composition. The faces of the condemned men are infused with emotion, which brings their suffering to life. By contrast, the bodies of the dead that surround them quickly merge back into the dark background, creating a sense that the vital emotion these individuals display is about to be erased by the firing squad's rifles. Goya's loose and expressive handling of paint can also be seen in the soldiers' weapons, the despairing crowd, and the slashes of red, alizarin crimson which streak the execution ground. In many passages, the painting looks rough and unpolished, but this helps Goya to capture a sense of frantic emotion and draws us back again and again to emphasize with the anguished faces of the condemned. All of this emphasis on the suffering of these figures and the emotional response Goya is seeking from us are traits of a new style of art that was emerging at the time: Romanticism. Goya is considered a bit of a forerunner to Romantic art, and the 3rd of May shows us why, particularly in contrast to other, more traditional paintings on the subject of war and sacrifice. Romantic art differed from the dominant styles of the day by its emphasis on the emotional and the individual. It believed in the mythical and spiritual nature of man, and privileged the power of nature and beauty over the more rational and logical ways of thinking that were dominant in the classical styles. Goya, while coming a little bit before Romanticism properly emerged, displays many of the traits of the style in the 3rd of May. The emphasis on the individual and their emotional state, the way he frames the soldiers as inhumane, and the loose fluid brushwork all evoke the Romantic style, and set the work apart from more traditional depictions of war and sacrifice. Perhaps the best way to understand just how different this image is from more traditional depictions of war is to contrast it with another well-known work that deals with similar themes in a very different way, The Oath of the Horatii, by the French neoclassical painter Jacques-Louis David. David was an academic painter who was deeply involved in the politics of the French Revolution. He's an interesting figure that we will explore in more depth someday, but for now I just want to focus on this one particular work, which was created by David partially as a call to arms and a justification for what he saw as a necessary armed struggle. The work uses the motif of the Roman legend of the Horatii, who we see here taking a solemn oath of arms to band together and kill their enemies. Unfortunately, those enemies include the families of their wives, who sit weeping in the corner for no matter what the outcome they will lose. The painting displays the traits of neoclassical painting, such as smooth, imperceptible brushwork, a balanced composition based on strong shapes and symmetry, and an emphasis on noble themes such as heroism, loyalty, and sacrifice. Now, all of this is well and good, but there's a little problem. Behind the heroics of the Horatii and their noble sacrifice, beyond the tidy brushwork and the rational composition, there is a reality that David is glossing over, the reality of conflict. David's work is essentially propaganda, designed to incite revolutionary fervour by drumming up legends of the past and framing them as a moral imperative we must follow. In this quality, the contrast between the Oath of the Horatii and Goya's 3rd of May becomes clear. Goya shows us the grim reality of the actions David is glorifying. The 3rd of May in many ways is Goya's critique of the kind of painting David was engaged in. It even takes many of its own compositional cues from David's work and inverts them to reveal the actuality of the suffering such glorifications of war often resulted in. While David dresses his call to arms in mythological references and languages of heroism and masculinity, Goya instead places his in the modern day and focuses on the tragic rather than the heroic. The grouping of two sets of figures which contrast each other is also paralleled, but with their positions and the emphasis switched. Our heroes now suffer, and the expression of war itself becomes villainous. While David's work is a call to arms, Goya's is a repudiation of war itself. While the 2nd and 3rd of May were a reaction to the atrocities of the Napoleonic invasion, they were not created until many years after the events took place. During the invasion, Goya had kept his job as a court painter, only now he served under Napoleon's appointed proxy, his brother Joseph. Goya was initially hopeful that this would result in reform and a better future for Spain under more enlightened rulers, which was of course not the case. Instead, the atrocities continued until the invasion ended and the Spanish monarchy was restored. In the aftermath of the war, Ferdinand VII, the odious little toad that Hughes pointed out, became king. Unlike the reforming Charles III or the more hands-off Charles IV, Ferdinand VII was no fan of social reforms, and instead of seeking to improve his countrymen's lot, he ended up restoring much of the monarchy's power and rolling back many of the previously made advances. He even went so far as to reinstate the Spanish Inquisition, which of course nobody expected. All of this political upheaval meant that Goya needed to demonstrate his loyalty to preserve his job security. Hence his creation of the 2nd and 3rd of May, which memorialised the revolutionaries and also served to clear Goya of accusations of collaboration. The French invasion and subsequent restoration of the monarchy also had another effect on the ageing artist. It furthered his growing disillusion with politics. The ideas of the Enlightenment that the younger Goya had been so enamoured with had played a large role in the French Revolution, and in the domino effect of history had eventually brought Napoleon to power and his forces to Spain. Perhaps the wide-eyed terror of the central figure in the 3rd of May expresses not only the terror of a man about to die, but also Goya's own fear of the ideas he had once thought so noble. The results of the war and its outcomes for Goya would be a change in his beliefs that reshaped his approach to art. The cruelties he witnessed in the war and the recoiling of the restored monarchy from the promised reforms left the aging Goya doubtful of man's very nature. On top of this, he also suffered from health problems, famously going deaf after suffering from a bout of an unknown disease. Unable to hear and no longer a believer in the system, Goya would slowly withdraw from public life in his old age. It wasn't all bad for him though. In this later period, he got something of a second wind and his works took a turn in a new direction. Unlike the oil paintings of his days at court, his later works would turn to the mediums of drawing and printmaking. Utilising the relative fluidity of these mediums, he captured scenes from both real life and his increasingly bleak imagination that sought to make sense of his experiences of war and the failings of his society. These prints would be published in a series of collections such as Los Caprichos, where he used allegorical drawings to criticise aspects of society from religion and superstition to inadequacies of law and education. Most famously summarised in this image with its inscription, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." These works were created by the process of aquatint, a printmaking technique which creates areas of tone rather than line, and they found their subjects in the folklore and tradition of rural Spain, still familiar to Goya from his youth. Many of these works make light of the failings Goya saw in Spanish society, and do so in frequently comedic ways, pointing out the ludicrous contradictions that he saw around him. Recurring characters include prostitutes scamming their clients, clergymen getting up to no good, doctors who do more harm to their patients than their ailments did, and most amusingly, repeated depictions of the nobility as donkeys. These images are often humorous and sometimes scathing, though Goya was clever enough to include a disclaimer stating that no one individual was intended as the target, thus protecting himself from charges of libel. The satirical nature of these works is perhaps where the idea that Goya was satirising the nobles in his court portraits comes from. And while it may not have been present in those works, it most definitely is in these. This points to the changing character of Goya's art, which by this point is displaying much more modernistic tendencies. starting with this skepticism of society at large. In addition to these satirical prints, he also spent many years during and after the occupation creating the now famous Disasters of War series, which railed against the horrors of war and the atrocities committed by both sides. So shocking was this subject matter that these works weren't published until about 35 years after Goya's death. Looking at them now, it's not hard to see why. Goya's work in the Disasters of War was based on scenes he claimed to have witnessed, and they often come across with the air of a documentary rather than any fictitious creation. The inscription commonly associated with this series, Yo lo vi, or I saw it, has also become famous and points to the reality of these atrocities, as well as Goya again placing the individual at the centre rather than retreating into collective myths of nationalism or heroism. Goya is not making these images to glorify his nation or justify its actions. He instead reframes conflict as a sea of individual acts of carnage and barbarity. The disasters of war are quite important for this reason. They shatter the narratives of heroism and bravery that otherwise obscure the true horrors experienced in war. As was the case in the 3rd of May, these images make the melodramatic depictions of heroism and loyalty common to painters such as David seem almost comically detached in the face of the suffering Goya is depicting. Their impact has been so widely felt that they have played a large role in reshaping our views of conflict, and many artists who came after Goya would turn a similar skeptical eye to war. Picasso's Guernica comes to mind as an image that would follow in this tradition. When we look at the subjects of the capricios, or the disasters, it paints a very unflattering picture of the era. The combination of superstition and the capacity for barbarism that Goya depicts may have been disheartening for a man like him who had been told all his life that better days were coming. As the aging and now permanently deaf Goya may have guessed after the war and the re-establishment of the monarchy, any serious change was by this point unlikely. Seeing no reason to remain at court, Goya packed it in. He sought release from his painterly duties and claimed his pension and retreated from Spain to Bordeaux, where he took up residence in a rural farmhouse which the locals conveniently already referred to as the House of the Deaf Man. Here he whiled away his days, occasionally painting an acquaintance or two, until his death in 1828. This, however, was not the whole story. Unbeknownst to all, Goya started one more body of work. In a scenario that seems more at home in the pages of a story by Lovecraft or Poe than art history, the old painter plumbed the depths of his lifetime's experiences, and from them dredged up images of such terrifying power that he dared not show anyone. Painting directly onto the walls of his home, he created a series of enigmatic images that have come to be known as the Black Paintings. The Black Paintings are unlike anything else in art history. Even today, they still resonate a power that can make them hard to look at. Their dark surfaces and the menagerie of demons and haunted faces that dwell upon them evoke something deep within us that no amount of fancy art terminology can ever hope to explain. The now infamous Saturn devouring his children is well known, but the images of hordes of peasants with tortured expressions, a Baphomet-style figure leading a black mass, two men fighting to the death as they sink into a bog, or the simple yet frightening composition of a dog struggling to stay afloat are all equally as haunting. Their rough brushwork and their strange dreamlike spaces move these paintings far beyond the core portraits of the early Goya, and make them look more akin to paintings of centuries later rather than Goya's own time. Their emotive content and loose painting, as well as the use of folklore, recalls the traits of romanticism, but even that doesn't really capture the totality of these works. Indeed, these paintings seem almost prescient, as if they flip a few pages ahead in history to steal from the surrealists and expressionists of the 20th century. To compound the mystery of these works, Goya himself said nothing of them. They were painted directly on the walls of his home and remained there until almost 50 years after his death, when they were haphazardly removed and transferred to canvas. This process damaged many of them and distorted the original compositions. Whether this made them more or less terrifying is impossible to say, but it certainly makes them even more mysterious. Not only do we not know what precisely drove Goya to make them, we now only have distorted, perhaps paler versions of the original works. It makes you wonder what it would have been like to see Saturn devouring his children in situ on the walls of the House of the Deaf Man. A good example of the evocative powers of these paintings is this work, known by many titles but most often simply as The Dog, in which Goya comes within a hair's breadth of abstract expressionism, when he creates a composition consisting of only three elements: a swirling background, a rising curve of dark vermilion red, and a blob of near shapeless black, suggestive of a dog, that peeks over the cresting curve. There's something deeply unsettling about how little is defined and yet how clearly it conveys ideas of struggle and inevitability. This painting, while minimal, expresses an anxiety we all feel at one stage or another in such an effective way that it still resonates today at a very basic and primal level. The seemingly prescient qualities of these paintings can be at times so bizarre and out of place that the question of what Goya was up to when he created these works has perplexed art historians ever since they came to light. I don't think I'll be able to solve this mystery here either, but I will offer one possible explanation based on what we know about Goya himself and in particular his politics. Goya made these works at the end of his life, after he had suffered through illness, war, and perhaps most disheartening of all, the failure of the ideas he had championed as a young man. The promised reforms of Charles III had not come to pass, and worse, many of those seemingly noble ideas had resulted in carnage and atrocities such as the French Revolution and Spanish Peninsular War. These experiences must have coloured Goya's views of man, and the black paintings can be read as his interpretation of why those well-meaning reforms had failed. The monstrous appearances of the black paintings perhaps indicates that despite the noble ideas of the Enlightenment, beneath it all, man was governed by baser instincts which precluded the possibility of reform in the first place. These creatures can be seen as the inversion of Enlightenment liberalism, the failure of reform given a visual expression. They are the very demons that are produced by the sleep of reason. We can see the traces of this failure of ideology in many of the black paintings, perhaps most famously Saturn devouring his children. In the traditional myth, Saturn swallowed his children whole, and they were later regurgitated when the clever Jupiter, or Zeus depending on the version, escaped the dinner table and fed his cruel father poison. In this rendition, such a happy ending is impossible, as the wide-eyed Titan tears at his child's flesh. His expression shows recognition of his actions, but also an inability to stop. Goya's violent version of the tale can be seen as allegorical of the old systems of monarchy and superstition devouring their enlightened successors. Considered in this light, the black paintings seem to display many of the traits of modern painting that Goya was establishing. Unlike the court paintings of his youth, these works use imagination for inspiration. Their expressive brushwork and unusual compositions are used to evoke feelings of fear and instability. They are critical of their subjects rather than glorifying, and above all, they were created by Goya himself because he wanted to, not because of a patron who commissioned him. All these traits would be present in modern art, which was still over a century away, and they mark the black paintings as thoroughly modern works to this day. Perhaps the reason why these works seem so ahead of their time, beyond their content and the strange subjects, is that prescient quality. Their representation of the political failures of the day is unfortunately still relevant to us now as it was then. The promises of the modern era, similar to those of the Enlightenment, told us that things would be better, that science, reason and logic would lead us out of the darkness and into an era of enlightened prosperity. One need only look to the inhumane conditions of the Industrial Revolution and the unimaginable mechanised slaughter of the First World War to see how the failures of reform in Goya's day would repeat again and again. Perhaps this is why we still find the black paintings so hard to look at. They remind us that despite our best efforts, those sleeping monsters are always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge again. Goya's life and career are quite representative of the changing societal structures that govern how we produce art. From painting being a tool of wealthy aristocrats to glorify themselves, to something the artist undertakes without commission, driven by imagination and a personal vision. As we approach the cavalcade of dissonance that is art in the 20th century, it would be pertinent to keep Goya and his final series of black paintings in mind, as their pessimistic outlook will unfortunately be relevant time and time again. Now, we made it. Thanks for listening. I hope that was useful and I didn't get too much wrong. If you have any comments or feedback, or if you did notice anything I messed up on, sure, let me know. Comments down below and all that. We're going to keep going as usual, month by month, but I have a little bit of work to do this month coming, so hopefully the next video will be on time. We're going to be taking a look at Matisse, though I may interrupt our little schedule. I'm going to be heading out to Connemara in the west of Ireland to do a residency, and as a result I was thinking I might detour slightly to talk about an Irish artist for once. Paul Henry, who's an interesting figure, and since I'll be in an area that he spent a lot of time painting in, could be nice, so I'll see how it goes. Anyway, next time, if we don't discuss Henry, we will be covering Matisse, and then we're going to get into some of the big lads of the 20th century, Duchamp in particular, who I'm looking forward to. Yeah, lots to cover. Hope everyone's doing well out there. We're nearly out of lockdown at this stage. I want to continue doing videos, so bear with me if there's any slight delays, because like everyone else, I'm probably going to have to go back to work at some stage, right? So that's it for this month. Thanks for listening again, and I'll see you soon.